The Republican National Convention continued Wednesday with speeches from Vice President Mike Pence, his wife, Karen Pence, and White House Counselor Kellyanne Conway. Pence delivered the evening's keynote address from Baltimore's Fort McHenry, whose defense of the city's harbor from the British in the War of 1812 inspired the writing of The Star-Spangled Banner, and he's expected to lean heavily on patriotic themes as he makes the case for a second term and draws a contrast with former Vice President Joe Biden. Conway had one of her most highest-profile moments just days before she leaves the White House. The senior advisor, who managed the president's campaign in the final months of the 2016 election, has announced she will leave the administration at the end of the month to focus more on her family. Other featured speakers included White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, Sens. Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee and Joni Ernst of Iowa, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, the president's daughter-in-law and campaign advisor Lara Trump, and the former acting director of national intelligence Richard Grenell. Download the NBC News app for full coverage and alerts on the latest news. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, in her Republican National Convention speech Wednesday, accused Democrats, and only Democrats, of running cities that have been taken over by violent mobs. From Seattle and Portland, to Washington and New York, Democrat-run cities across this country are being overrun by violent mobs. The violence is rampant. There's looting, chaos, destruction and murder. This is a substantial distortion and exaggeration of the facts. Outrage over the death of George Floyd, who died in May after the white Minneapolis police officer arresting him knelt on his neck for more than 8 minutes, sparked protests against police brutality and in support of racial justice all over the country, in cities and states run by both Democrats and Republicans. While the cities Noem listed all have Democratic mayors, and are all in states with Democratic governors with the exception of Washington, D.C., protests have taken place in at least 450 cities across the U.S. Those included large ones in Miami, whose mayor is a registered Republican. Protests also arose in smaller cities and towns in regions supportive of Trump. Furthermore, Noem's claim that the cities she spoke of were overrun by violent mobs is outright false. The protests across the U.S. in recent months were largely peaceful. Violent incidents did occur, but many were initiated by outside groups with political agendas. Violence during recent protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which formed after a black man, Jacob Blake, was shot 7 times in the back by a police officer, appears to be following a similar pattern as protesters are met by armed pro-police counter-activists. Read more here. Texas Rep.